May 27, 1942. Pearl Harbor, a basement under Building 1 of the 14th Naval District. No windows, no daylight. Air thick with cigarette smoke and cold enough that the man at the center of the room is wearing a burgundy smoking jacket over his uniform and slippers on his feet. He has not slept. He has been awake all night with two of his officers, chewing on a single group of numbers. His name is Joseph Rochefort. He is 42 years old. He did not go to Annapolis, and he runs the code and signal section they call Station HYPO. In the week just finished, his basement has handled between 500 and 1,000 Japanese naval messages a day. He can read perhaps 10 to 15% of the code those messages are written in. On the strength of that, he is about to walk upstairs and tell the commander of the Pacific Fleet where the Imperial Japanese Navy will be, on which morning, coming from which direction, with how many carriers. Washington has already told that same admiral that Rochefort is wrong. Everyone remembers the 4 carriers burning. Almost nobody remembers the room. In May of 1942, the United States Navy had 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific Ocean, and one of them was Hold. Japan had run the table for 6 months. On May 8th at the Coral Sea, the Americans lost the carrier Lexington and got the Yorktown back with a bomb hole through her. 3 flight decks, 1 ocean, 64 million square miles of it. Here is the problem that made Rochefort's basement the most important room in the Pacific. Nimitz could not defend everything. He had to know where the blow was falling, and there was no machine on Earth that could tell him. Radar saw 20 miles. A scout plane saw a few hundred. The Japanese fleet would be assembling 2,000 miles away, under radio discipline, behind an ocean. The only way to know was to read their mail. And their mail could not be read. Not really. The Japanese fleet code was a 5-digit code, super-enciphered with an additive book. The Americans were intercepting roughly 60% of the traffic, analyzing about 40% of that, and actually breaking 10 to 15% of it. Fragments, pieces of sentences. A ship here, a date group there. The Imperial Japanese Navy of May 1942 was, by several honest measures, the finest navy afloat. The best carrier aviators in the world, the best torpedo, the best night-fighting doctrine. 6 months of unbroken victory from Hawaii to Ceylon. And they were not careless men. Their fleet code was due for a wholesale change of the additive book on the 1st of April. It slipped. It was postponed again. Somewhere in Tokyo, a scheduling decision was quietly made, and nobody thought about it twice. They had watched Pearl Harbor before, too. In March, they had flown 2 enormous flying boats all the way to Oahu, refueling them from submarines at an empty coral lagoon called French Frigate Shoals, 500 miles up the Hawaiian chain. It had worked. They filed the method away for the next time they needed to see inside the American base. The combined fleet's plan for Midway was built on one assumption. The American carriers would not be at sea. They would come out after the island was hit, and the submarines would catch them coming. It was a sound plan inside its own frame. The frame was what was wrong. In the second week of May, the volume of Japanese naval traffic began to climb, and a 2-letter geographic designator started appearing over and over. A F Station HYPO was not a laboratory. It was not a bureau. It was a windowless room about the size of a pool hall, 1 door, an armed Marine standing on it, 4 working sections, and a bank of IBM punch card tabulating machines that sorted 5-digit code groups the way a librarian sorts a catalog. The man who ran it had come up through the fleet, learned Japanese on a 3-year language billet in Tokyo, and spent his career in a discipline the Navy barely recognized as a career. He was not the great cryptanalyst in the room. That was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer. Rochefort was the man who ran the code breakers, and the man who could look at 100 broken fragments and see a fleet in them. If you had walked down those stairs in the last week of May, you would have found men on 12-hour watches who slept on cots without leaving the building, who went days without a shower, and who had run so short of manpower that the Navy handed Rochefort the band of the battleship USS California. Their ship was sitting on the bottom of the harbor. The musicians were put to work sorting punch cards. Now the objection from Washington. Naval communications had been reorganized. Captain Joseph Redmond held the top job. His brother, Commander John Redmond, had been installed to run OP-20G, the code section in Washington. Neither man was a cryptanalyst, and their position was not stupid. It was this: a theater outstation does not get to write the strategic estimate for an entire ocean. Washington has more machines, more analysts, more intercept stations, and the whole war to see. That is the system. That is what the system is for. The system was not wrong about its own logic. It was wrong about the ocean. The desk outranked the basement. There was one difference between HYPO and every other station, and it was not equipment. Rochefort reported straight to Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer, by scrambler telephone. Basement to Admiral in a few minutes, with nothing in between. HYPO had already earned that line. It had called the Coral Sea and put an American carrier force in the right water in the right week. Before we go into the last 10 days, one thing. Of the men who did this work, almost none were ever publicly named, and most never spoke of it in their lifetimes. A like on this video puts their names in front of a few more people. It is a small thing, and it is not nothing. Mid-May. The traffic keeps climbing, and the picture in the basement keeps hardening. AF sits inside a family of Japanese geographic designators that begin with the letter A, and the A group is the Hawaiian chain and its outlying islands. Rochefort had been watching AF move through Japanese traffic for months, in contexts that fit one place and no other. Around him, his people are pulling out fragments of an operation order: a landing force, a screening force, a carrier striking force, an occupation date group. A second, smaller operation aimed north at the Aleutians. The machines run, the cards drop. The room stays cold, and the smoke hangs at the level of the overhead lights. And it is 3 in the morning again, and it is always 3 in the morning down there. Rochefort tells Layton the target is Midway. Washington answers, and Washington says no. OP-20G had AF somewhere else. Over the following days, Washington's estimate moved. Port Moresby, the Aleutians, Johnston Island, Hawaii itself, the west coast of the United States. The Army command on Oahu was convinced the Japanese were coming back to finish Pearl Harbor and wanted the fleet held close. Every one of those estimates was built by serious professionals from real intercepts. And here is what that meant for the man in the basement. He had the target, he had the approximate date. He did not have Washington. If Nimitz believed him, Nimitz would take every flight deck in the Pacific Ocean, 2 of them borrowed from a fight they had barely survived, and send them 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, leaving the base, the islands, and the American coastline uncovered. If Rochefort was wrong, he would not die for it. Somebody else would. Tens of thousands of somebody else's. He had days. Maybe not that. On or about May 19th, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes proposed a trick. Have Midway send a message in the clear, over the open air, saying its water evaporators had broken down, and the garrison was short of fresh water. If the Japanese picked it up and repeated it in their own code, using their own designator, the designator would identify itself. Rochefort could have kept doing what he had been doing, which was arguing the evidence on the merits, through channels, and losing. He took the trick instead. What he reportedly said to his own people was this: "We have got to prove to the world that AF is Midway." Notice what he was not doing. He was not trying to find out whether AF was Midway. He already knew. Nimitz had been persuaded by roughly May 16th, days before anybody mentioned water. The ruse was never aimed at Tokyo. It was aimed at Washington. The instruction went to Midway by undersea cable, so the Japanese would never see the order, only the result. Midway broadcast in plain language. And around May 22nd, Japanese naval traffic reported that AF was short of fresh water. Rochefort did not even claim it. He let the Allied station in Australia report the intercept, on the calculation that Washington would believe Melbourne faster than it would believe him. Read that sentence again and understand what it tells you about what the man was up against. Now go west and look at the other side of it. At the end of May, a Japanese submarine slid in toward that same empty coral lagoon at French frigate shoals to make sure it was clear for the flying boats. It was not clear. An American seaplane tender was sitting in it because Nimitz had put her there. The second reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor was canceled outright. Combined fleet would sail without ever laying eyes on the American carriers. May 27th. Pacific Fleet Headquarters. Rochefort is 30 minutes late because he and two of his officers spent the night breaking out a date and time group, and he would not walk in without it. Nimitz gives him a look that men who received it remembered for the rest of their lives and asks him what the Japanese are going to do. Hold the room there for a moment. An admiral with 3 carriers, an outstation commander who has not slept, and the entire Pacific balanced on a fragment. Rochefort gives him the target. Midway. He gives him the striking force. 4 carriers from the northwest. He gives him the approach bearing, the approximate date, and the northern diversion into the Aleutians that will open first. Nimitz could have split the difference. He could have held his carriers near Hawaii, covered the base, protected the coast, and let Midway take its chances. That was the safe, defensible, career-preserving choice, and it was the choice Washington's estimate pointed to. He believed the basement. Yorktown came into Pearl Harbor leaking oil and went out again in about 72 hours, patched, with yard workers still aboard. She sailed on the 30th of May. By the first days of June, 3 American carriers were sitting northeast of Midway at a point on the chart the staff had named Point Luck, waiting. And then the window closed. In the last days of May, the Japanese fleet finally changed the code. The additive book that had been due in April went into effect. The traffic went dark. Rochefort had read the Midway operation on its way out the door, and then there was nothing left to read. 400 miles to the northwest, a staff officer aboard a Japanese carrier was working the morning search plan. It was thin. 7 aircraft, launched in a single sweep, because Japanese carrier doctrine held aircraft back for striking, not for looking. The submarine picket lines meant to catch the Americans coming out of Pearl Harbor were still moving into position. They would arrive after the American carriers had already gone past them. June 4th, 1942. 0603 in the morning. A Catalina flying boat out of Midway sends a contact report. 2 carriers and battleships, bearing 320, distance 180, course 135, speed 25 knots. Nimitz had told Leighton to give him a guess, and Leighton had given him a bearing, a distance, and a time. Afterward, Nimitz told him he had been about 5 degrees, 5 miles, and 5 minutes off. Leighton told that story himself 40 years later. It is his memory and not a document, and I will not pretend otherwise. What is not in dispute is that when the Japanese carriers came over the horizon, 3 American flight decks were already there, upwind, waiting, and the Japanese did not know it. By the end of that day, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning. The Yorktown was hit and hit again, and finally torpedoed by a submarine 2 days later, taking the destroyer USS Hammond down alongside her. Rochefort had been right about all of it, and in Washington that was the problem. The desk outranked the basement. Before the analysis, one asked, and it is the one that matters most on this channel. If your father, your grandfather, or your great-uncle served in the Pacific, in the boats, in the armed guard, or in a job he was never allowed to talk about, put his name, his ship, and his hometown in the comments. Here is the number. In the last week before Nimitz issued his orders, Station HYPO was handling between 500 and 1,000 Japanese naval messages a day. Set that against what they could actually do with them. 60% of the traffic intercepted, roughly 40% of that analyzed, 10 to 15% broken well enough to yield plain text, and often only fragments of it. They did not break the Japanese naval code. They read the seams in it 500 to 1,000 times a day until the seams made a shape. That was not genius. That was a system. Intercept stations strung across the Pacific, feeding one room. Punch card machines that could hold a code recovery in a drawer and find it again in an hour. Traffic analysis that could track a fleet by the shape of its radio habits without reading a word. And at the top of it, an admiral who was willing to act on a fragment, and a wire that ran from the basement to that admiral's intelligence officer without passing through anybody's tray. Japan had radio intelligence too. Their problem was structural, and it is worth naming precisely, because it is the whole battle. Their signals unit aboard the flagship picked up indications of American naval activity near Hawaii on May 30th. That warning never reached Nagumo, the admiral commanding the carriers. He learned of it after the battle. Their reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor had been canceled and not replaced. Their submarine screen was late. Their search plan was 7 aircraft because their doctrine did not value looking, and their plan assumed what the enemy would do instead of finding out. They had the pieces. They had no pipeline. Every one of those failures is an institutional failure, and not one of them is a failure of courage. They wrote it down themselves. Nagumo's own detailed battle report on the Midway operation, dated June 15, 1942, sets out the estimate of the situation his force sailed on. The enemy is not aware of our plans. It is not believed that the enemy has any powerful unit, with carriers as its nucleus, in the vicinity. That is not a caricature. That is the considered professional judgment of the most successful carrier admiral alive on the morning of the battle, written in his own report. 3 years later, the captain of the carrier Akagi told American interrogators when he first realized the American carriers were there. His answer was that the first indication was the dive-bombing attack that hit his ship. They tried. The reconnaissance flight over Pearl Harbor was canceled because an American ship was anchored where the flying boats needed to refuel. The submarine cordons arrived after the American carriers had already passed, and the one Japanese float plane that did find the American fleet from the cruiser Tone launched about 30 minutes late. That delay is the most famous accident in the battle, and it deserves an honest footnote. Modern analysis argues that had the aircraft flown its assigned track on schedule, it would most likely have missed the American carriers entirely. Afterward, the combined fleet did not conclude that their code had been read. They blamed inadequate search. They kept using the code. They were right that their carriers were the finest instrument in the Pacific. They were right that their aviators were better trained. What they were wrong about was that the Americans were guessing, and the American who paid for that is the one nobody put on a poster. Edwin Layton, the fleet intelligence officer, spent the war being the man who had to say out loud to a 4-star admiral what a basement had inferred from fragments. He was the wire. When it was over, he never let anyone forget where the information had come from, and it took him most of his life to get that on the record. So, could Japan have found the American carriers before the American carriers found them? They could not, and the reason is not luck. Nimitz recommended Joseph Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal on June 8, 1942, 4 days after the battle. Admiral King refused it. In October, Rochefort was ordered to Washington on temporary duty and quietly relieved. The two brothers running naval communications had spent 3 months arranging it. He spent the rest of the war supervising the construction of a floating dry dock in San Francisco Bay. He never worked in cryptanalysis again. Japan lost the battle because a warning sat on a flagship and never reached the man who needed it. America won it because a fragment traveled from a basement to an admiral in about 4 minutes. The cost: 307 Americans died at Midway. The Yorktown and the Hamon went down. Torpedo Squadron 8 went in against the Japanese carriers with 15 aircraft, and 1 man came out of the water alive. On the other side, 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen died, most of them below decks, in ships they could not save. Rochefort did not win Midway. He put 3 carriers in the right patch of ocean. Men who were not him flew off those decks and did the rest, and a great many of them did not come back, and he knew it, and he said so for the rest of his life. The Distinguished Service Medal was finally approved in 1985 and presented at the White House to his family in 1986. Joseph John Rochefort of Dayton, Ohio, had been dead since 1976. The desk outranked the basement, and then the desk wrote the paperwork. There is a room under Building 1 at Pearl Harbor with no windows in it. A man in a smoking jacket and slippers sat in that room, reading between 500 and 1,000 enemy messages a day in a code he had never fully broken, and he told his country the truth, and his country did not want to hear it from him. It took the United States Navy 43 years to admit he was right. It took Joe Rochefort about 7 days. Subscribe if you want the next one. There are more of these, more ships, more crews, and more names the record was never supposed to keep.